The day is May 3rd, 1947, and Japan has just endured its worst era in history. After decades of imperialism, the country established a law, banning it from ever going to war to settle disputes. But as China becomes more overconfident and threatening, it seems like Japan has had enough, and this clause could be coming to an end. As international tensions keep on rising, the world is constantly looking out for what might be the next major conflict. The whole world is currently fixated on the Ukraine-Russia war, but with a ceasefire agreement possibly coming into effect, turning attention further east might be the next logical step. Today, we look at Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution and how this could soon come to an end as Japan plans for war. The country of Japan has a storied history, marred by human rights abuses, victories, and humiliating defeats. However, Japan has rebounded. It has the world's fourth largest economy, only recently losing the third spot to Germany. However, India is projected to overtake both Japan and Germany by 2026. But what is surprising is the fact that Stanford classifies Japan as a small nation, and it has a surface area of 145,869 square miles. Moreover, the country has about 124 million citizens. But what is becoming a problem is the aging population. Due to years of productivity, the aggregate age in the country is now close to 50, with more than 1/3 of the population over the age of 65. While this doesn't seem like an issue, it is currently affecting the Japanese workforce, while putting a lot of extra pressure on things like healthcare. With fewer and fewer people entering the job market, it naturally extends to the military as well. The Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF, as they are known, has a very small standing army of about 250,000 active personnel, with another 60,000 people in reserve. This means that Japan doesn't have the manpower to go toe-to-toe with giants like China. While the extent of the Chinese army is not fully known, the country claims to have about 2 million active personnel, basically outnumbering their eastern rival by about 10-1. Add Article 9 to the mix, which we will get into in a bit, and you can see just how many problems Japan will have if China chooses to make a move. Thankfully, the United States has about 55,000 active troops in the country, and this contributes to its security. These troops are armed with the best U.S. equipment, and even Navy vessels are often found docking at the Yokosuka harbor, which provides a massive deterrence for the country. Unfortunately, no one knows if the United States has nuclear weapons in Japan, and the U.S. State Department maintains a stance that there are no U.S. nuclear weapons in Japan. So, why does Japan have such a small army? And why is their military called the Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF? Before we continue, make sure to like this video and subscribe for your daily military report. During the Second World War, Japan was still an imperial country and had absolutely no business entering the war. The country mostly focused on its local neighborhood, but on December 7th, 1941, a surprise attack was launched on the United States Pacific Fleet at its naval base in Oahu, Hawaii. The attack was the first of its kind from a foreign actor on U.S. soil, and would not only change the tide of the war, but basically change the country of Japan forever. While numerous Japanese Mitsubishi RZ CA-6M0 fighters, the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, and the Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers would rattle the United States, a new program pioneered by Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer was taking place. Codenamed the Manhattan Project, this unique moment in time would not only change history, but it is largely responsible for the world we live in today. Following these attacks on Pearl Harbor, the United States got directly involved, launching numerous missions to Japan. By now, the empire was part of the Axis powers, which consisted of Nazis, Italy, Japan, and a host of other smaller countries. However, 6th August 1945 would mark a change in the history and future of Japan, as the United States loaded up the coveted B-29 bomber known as Enola Gay, with its powerful atomic bomb. The bomb was finally dropped on the empire of the rising sun, and it devastated Hiroshima. Another B-29 superfortress, named Boxcar, would drop the second of these bombs on Nagasaki, and with one fatal movement, the Japanese participation in this war had come to an end. The bombings killed between 150,000 and 246,000 people, while maiming many others, who would have to live the rest of their lives with what happened. The moment stunned the world and would ultimately contribute to the end of World War II. Following the peace between the United States and Japan, Article 9 was added to the Constitution. In this article, the state formally renounces the sovereign right of belligerency and aims at an international peace based on justice and order. It continues by saying that to accomplish these aims, armed forces with war potential will not be maintained. It is quite a mouthful, but basically means that regardless of the disagreements or insults thrown at Japan, the country would never retaliate by going to war. Furthermore, it also ensures that Japan doesn't have a large enough active military to do this. To protect Japan, a post-occupation U.S. military was stationed in Japan under the U.S.-Japan Mutual Cooperation and Security Treaty and Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF, which was founded in 1954 as the de facto post-war Japanese military. For many decades, Japan didn't have an active military, which is very similar to what Germany had signed at the end of World War I. However, Germany would not maintain this agreement, eventually rearming itself and leading to the Second World War. But just as Japan was focusing on growing its economy and quality of life, China became a major threat, forcing then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to approve a reinterpretation of Article 9. Under this new interpretation, Japan has the right to collective self-defense. This meant that Japan no longer needed to just rely on the United States, and it would be able to protect itself and even contribute in a material capacity to some of its international allies. Once the announcement became international news, most countries like the US, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia had a positive response to this. Naturally, China was the only country to draw some objection to the move, but no one knew whether they feared Japan or if China was willing to make a move on the former empire. Nowadays, Article 9 is still heavily debated, but what we do know is that Japan as a pacifist country doesn't plan to go to war, nor does it have much of an army to do so. Most of its personnel and troops work in a defensive capacity, possibly making them vulnerable. Over the years, China has gone on record to threaten Japan, with one of its biggest recent threats coming on September 2nd, 2024. At this time, Japan was limiting the sales of chip-making equipment to various firms. However, the Chinese sentiment was mostly focused on leveraging economic sanctions. However, China does have a far more advanced military that could potentially destroy Japan. But now, you might be thinking, if Japan has such excellent ties with the United States, wouldn't they eventually come to the aid of the country? Well, yes and no. Since taking office on January 20th, United States President Donald Trump has taken a very antagonistic stance on many of his opponents. The Commander-in-Chief has recently paused aid to Ukraine, despite the country now enduring its heaviest strikes in recent memory. Moreover, President Trump has also warned of the United States possibly ousting NATO, and that Europe might no longer fall under the U.S. protection umbrella. This has frightened Tokyo, who now feels that it might need to fend for itself in the near future. But judging by the Ukraine war as an example, we can see that the world doesn't react the way everyone expects when a nuclear power invades. Despite everything President Zelensky has done, losing any territory means that the country took a bit of a bloody nose in this contract. In fact, just a few days ago, on March 6, 2025, President Trump complained that the U.S. agreements with Japan are non-reciprocal. We have a great relationship with Japan, but we have an interesting deal with Japan that we have to protect them, But they don't have to protect us. Now, China might have noticed this and feels like they could do the same, as a way of just rattling up the status quo in Japan. With an ever-increasing threat, Japan had to take a few drastic decisions, with some of them being in direct contravention of Article 9. It should come as no surprise that every country is now focusing on how to protect itself. But there is also another very pivotal player in this East Asian situation. This is a man by the name of Kim Jong-un, or Little Rocket Man as President Trump likes to call him. In recent years, North Korea has launched a barrage of missile tests, with most of them landing in the Sea of Japan, which is a natural boundary between the two countries. North Korea is also becoming more emboldened when doing so. On November 3, 2022, Pyongyang shot a ballistic missile, which traveled over Japan, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. This was a very close call and led to numerous air raid sirens also going off. Japan has realized that if North Korea chooses to go nuclear, its first targets will be Japan and South Korea. It is for this reason that the Empire of the Rising Sun might be back, and now more powerful than ever. Japan announced that it would put some of its missiles on the southern island of Kyushu. By looking at a map, you can see that this means these missiles could reach the eastern coasts of both China and North Korea. These missiles, while unclear of their names, have a supposed range of about 620 miles, which does bring it quite close to China and will definitely pose a natural risk. The idea of this is to create some kind of deterrent and give Japan far more options if one of its eastern counterparts makes an aggressive move. Unfortunately, this infringes on Article 9 even further, but can be seen as a way of defending itself should something ever happen. As the United States continues to alienate itself from some of its many allies, more and more countries like Japan are seeking ways of breaking the U.S. stranglehold on their countries. Moreover, Japan is also increasing its defense spending year on year. Last year, Japan increased its military spending to about 1.7% of its GDP, which is quite a lot considering the country has the fifth biggest economy in the world. This number is also projected to go higher, potentially reaching the 2% mark by 2027. This is something the whole world is fearing, simply due to the facts of Pearl Harbor. However, President Trump should have smiled wide when he heard this announcement. Should Japan manage to effectively rearm itself, it doesn't become a further burden on the United States taxpayer. Moreover, Japan already has a lot of U.S. infrastructure and technology. Japan does have a decent fleet of its own weaponry, but the country also has around 40 F-35 aircraft. This means that it is all ready to move on, with a little bit of help from the U.S. to make the transition a little smoother. Once again, Trump will be happy with this. Not only does Japan spend more on military equipment, but the funding will be done through companies like Lockheed Martin. This brings more jobs and finances into the United States and helps to spur the economy. But what is the main reason for tensions arising between Beijing and Tokyo? First of all, China and Japan have had simmering tensions for almost the last century. These countries have been highly frustrated, with a major flashpoint being the Senkaku Islands, known as Diaoyu in China. These islands are currently administered by Japan, but China claims that they own the islands, citing historical ties disrupted by Japan's actions in the late 19th century. China currently deploys various Coast Guard vessels, with these Chinese Coast Guard vessels regularly entering the waters near the island as a way of infringing on Japan's sovereign territory. Moreover, China and Japan have also had a variety of disputes on a geopolitical level. The U.S.-Japan relationship is often cited for this, with Beijing believing that the U.S. should move away from Japan. The U.S. currently has the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, CSG-5, and the USS George Washington, CVN-73, which is often found off the coast of the country. With a U.S. strike group consisting of a plethora of ships, all of which work in conjunction with the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, it does serve to have a massive presence in the area. China doesn't want this so close to its borders, constantly ramping up pressure on the country. Should China make a move, the United States is ready to retaliate. But the biggest question is whether they will actually go so far as to attack the country. It is currently unclear if China feels the need to make such a controversial and antagonistic move. Japan, while under scrutiny from China, is one of the top U.S. trade partners. It is estimated that Japanese exports totaled close to $225 billion in 2024 alone. This means that if the trade doesn't work, it will leave a severe dent in the United States' supply, specifically when it comes to advanced technological equipment. If we think of it in an economical capacity, it doesn't make a lot of sense for China to try and force the issue with Japan. They will likely face a very similar situation, leading to isolation from the world in the form of sanctions if this is to happen. Moreover, China might be a nuclear superpower, but such extreme measures have a very low probability of being taken. Fortunately, China is heavily focused on reclaiming Taiwan, which naturally removes some of the pressure from Japan. It is no secret that Beijing is continually putting pressure on Taiwan, often being directly involved in its elections. Under the One China policy, it means that China still considers Taiwan as part of its territory, and this will likely not change anytime soon. With the advent of semiconductor chips we use every single day, Taiwan is a massive threat. A large part of these chips is sent to the United States and often used in a military capacity that could harm China itself. A major flashpoint in the China-Japan relations could take place if China plans to invade Taiwan. There is a lot of speculation about whether or not Japan will actually stand up for Taiwan. But will they? Various reports suggest that China should make such a move. It is almost certain that Japan would defend Taiwan. This is a matter of national security. Should China prevail in such a conflict, it would spell extreme danger for Japan. You see, a large part of Japan's trade goes through this Taiwan Strait. Currently, it is controlled by Taiwan, but if this changes, China can seriously damage Japan, especially when it comes to trade. However, the other part of the argument suggests that if Japan is to enter such a war, its small military might make it vulnerable to strikes from China. Such a move will bring the whole East to war, and it could even spill over to many other Western nations. In fact, many argue that if Japan enters the war, China will block the Taiwan Strait in any case, which hampers Japanese trade. This will essentially force Japan into the war as a way of self-preservation, which could lead to a war on a far grander stage. However, Article 9, especially in its current form, will continue to hamper Japan from making such a move. Moreover, the citizens also prefer having a more pacifist stance, which will put pressure on the Japanese government to not enter such a conflict. But even if China just invades Taiwan, it could lead to a far greater war that has the potential to possibly involve a lot of other countries that might not want to participate. For starters, Japan will get involved, and they simply cannot avoid this. Secondly, South Korea will possibly get involved with a lot of U.S. troops stationed there. The United States also has a few troops currently stationed in Taiwan. However, it is less than 100, and the Trump administration might choose to forego the territory and force it to rely on countries like Japan. Furthermore, another wild card is also bound to join this war, and this could be North Korea. The country has a lot of tension on its borders with Japan, and might see this as an opportunity to announce itself on a global stage. North Korea is also a very unpredictable country, which could lead to the country deploying some of its nuclear weapons. These could dramatically change the tide of and it might even lead to a greater nuclear war. Moreover, countries like the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and various other East Asian stakeholders could possibly find themselves in a large global war. The United States will also be forced to intervene. So, despite what the media continually tells you, the chances of China actually moving on to Japan are very slim. Moreover, China will also find that it is much easier to move on to Taiwan. But using economic sanctions and other punitive measures could be useful when China has to deal with Japan. This is a very scary situation, and if Japan does plan to drop Article 9 of its constitution, it will almost certainly lead to a lot of frustration from Beijing. But do you think Japan is right in rearming itself? Or should it solely rely on the United States for protection? Let us know in the comments below.